I've always loved the story of climbing, the history, the culture, and I read a lot of the old books. I love the European story, Gaston Rebefel, Lionel Terray, Louis Lachenel. And you know, I always noticed that there was just so little about the Canadian story. It's just an unknown story, the story of Canadian climbing, or at least it was then. In 1994, I had sort of embarked on a career as a writer. I came out with one of my first books. It wasn't my first book, but one of them, Summits and Icefields, the ski touring guide, came out in the autumn, and I didn't know quite what I was going to do next. I went up to the Stanley Mitchell hut in the Little Yoho, and you know, I spent 5 months up there, a lot of it by myself, sitting by the fire, working a little bit on different projects, and then it hit me in about March. The time has come to write the history of Canadian climbing, to write the whole thing. I had thought about it for years, and the time was right. So I put my skis on, skied down the trail, got in my car, drove back to Calgary, went over to Rocky Mountain Books and talked to Tony Daffern, who owned Rocky Mountain Books, and I told him about my idea, and he said, yeah, good idea. Yeah, write a couple of chapters, I'll look at them. We'll see, we'll think about it. Well, on that, we worked for 6 years together. We never signed a contract. We worked on trust and respect. We cooperated. And working with Gillian Daffern, his wife, who also owns Rocky Mountain Books, the three of us worked together. And then we worked for 6 years. And then on the day we sent the book to the printer, the last day, we signed a contract. So it's just great when you work with people who you really trust. They were like a big brother and sister to me. They wanted to tell the stories, the Rocky Mountain stories or the whole Canadian stories. They weren't in it to make money. They didn't want to lose money, of course. They wanted to tell the stories. They wanted to get them out there. I originally thought the project might take 2 years, but after 2 years, I realized it was going to take a lot more. In the end, it took 6 years before it came to completion. And what I discovered was that there were endless numbers of great stories and great mountains. Most people, if you ask them, name a country with mountains, a mountainous country, would say, oh, Switzerland or Nepal. They would never think Canada. But I think Canada probably has more real mountain geography, real peaks with glaciers and big cliffs than any other country in the world. I would say a quarter or a third of Canada's area is made up of real mountains. We've got the Rockies, we've got the Coast Mountains, we've got the St. Elias Mountains in the Yukon. That area from the tip of Ellesmere Island all the way down through Baffin, all the way down Labrador to Newfoundland, that's all a giant mountain range. And then over in eastern Canada, in Quebec, you have the Laurentian Mountains. Yeah, they're not glaciated, but they have big cliffs, and there's many climbers down there who love those mountains. After Pushing the Limits came out, it gave me credentials. It gave me sort of veritas, authenticity as a historian and a writer. The first thing I did is I went all across Canada, from Quebec to BC, giving lectures on Pushing the Limits, the history of Canadian climbing. It was organized through the Alpine Club of Canada. I think I gave 21 talks, all the way from Montreal to Victoria and Nanaimo and everything in between, sold some books. I think the book really brought Canadian climbers together. I had wanted to include the whole country. I wanted to do a little bit for nation building. There's a big section on Quebec, the climbing, the history, the ice climbing, the rock climbing. I spent 3 months in Quebec researching the story, collecting photographs, doing interviews. And when the book came out, I got the most beautiful letter in French from the mayor of Val David up in the Laurentian Mountains north of Montreal. And he wrote me this letter thanking me for doing such a nice job of presenting his little mountain village and his mountains. He said, our mountains may not be as big as the Rockies, but we love them with a passion. And thank you very much for doing such a nice job of presenting our village. So I was really pleased with that. Up north in the Arctic Islands, there's climbing and mountains all over the Arctic Islands. And, something that might end up being one paragraph in Pushing the Limits, for example, the climbing on Axel Heiberg Island or something, might have taken me a week going through the old journals at the Arctic Institute to figure out what had been done up there. So everything's in there. And I hope that the book went a little ways to promoting Canadian unity and making us all realize that we're a tribe, that we all share the same values, and we're a community, and we all love the same sport, and we all love mountains. The scope of Pushing the Limits ended up being huge, way more than I could have imagined. Some people might have just written about the Rocky Mountains and maybe a little bit about Mount Logan, but I wrote about the whole country, the big cliffs, the big icy mountains in the Yukon, and the little cliffs. It ended up being a huge project, and took me 6 years to complete. So I tell the story of the first climbers here in the Rockies and their Swiss guides, the CP hotels, and the first big ascents. And I call that first chapter the glory days, when they got the big first ascents. And then that chapter sort of ends with the first ascent of Mount Logan, the highest mountain wholly in Canada. That was 1925. And then Mount Alberta here in the Rockies was also climbed in 1925. So that big chapter, the glory days, goes up to 25. Out there on the coast, right in 1925, Don and Phil Munday climbed to the top of Mount Arrowsmith on Vancouver Island, and they looked across at the mainland, and they saw a big snowy peak in the distance that they called Mystery Mountain, and they went in search of it. So part 3 of the book, one of the big stories, of course, is the story of the discovery, the search, and the climb of what is now called Mount Waddington. But over almost half the book is on mountaineering after 1950. That's really when Canadian climbing, and particularly climbing in Canada, done by Canadians, born in Canada Canadians, really happens. Out on the West Coast, climbing on Squamish started, the Grand Wall, Tim Odger, Glenn Woodsworth, Hamish Much, those guys. So the second half of the book covers the post-war era. Of course, I covered Canadians climbing overseas as well. So the book is about all the climbing done in Canada by Canadians or by other nationalities. And it's also about the climbing that Canadians have done overseas in Yosemite, down in South America, in the Cordillera Blanca, and in the Himalayas. So there's all those great stories about Laurie Skreslet, Sharon Wood, Pat Morrow, and Barry Blanchard, and all those people in the Himalayas. They're great climbing over there. So that's another part of the book. And then the last part of the book was actually almost the hardest to write, which is the modern part of the book. The new part, sport climbing, competition climbing, gym climbing. It was difficult because most of those stories aren't in the journals. They're in magazines. And a lot of those really good stories are told in magazines, which they're a little hard to track down. But I got all those stories, and so the book goes right up to the year 2000, right up to the last the last big climbs done by Canadians in 2000, and that's where the book ends. So I pulled together the manuscript of all these climbs across Canada, but then I had to add something to it. I had drawn all of my information from journal articles and magazine articles, but I needed to talk with the men and women who had done these climbs, the ones that were still alive. So I went across Canada and did these interviews. I did, I think, 84 interviews that I videotaped, and then another 10 interviews or so that I just audio taped. And I went all across the country and got the stories. Hans Moser helped me greatly. He realized, as I did, that these interviews down the road would be a great treasure. I was writing a book, so all I really needed were the words. I didn't need the video, but I knew I had the opportunity to really catch something special to preserve it. So I took along this video camera that I borrowed from Jeff Boyd, and Hans Moser, he supported me. He loved the work that I was doing, and he realized that this would be a great treasure down the road. I ended up sleeping in my truck out there in Vancouver. I sort of based myself on Kitsilano Beach there. I cooked on the tailgate of my truck. I showered in the public showers there where people wash the salt water off after swimming in the ocean. In the evening, when it got dark, I drove up above Kitsilano, up the hill, and found a nice quiet street, pulled over, turned the car off, turned the lights off, and put my seat back, pulled my sleeping bag on, and I slept there. I made all my arrangements for the interviews at a payphone. Of course, it was pre-cell phones, so I called from a payphone. It was very hard for them to phone me back, but it worked, and I got all those interviews in BC with people like Patty Sherman and Phipps Broda, Scott Flavel, John Clark, Tammy Knight. I even got Tammy Knight. So I went across Canada. I was down in Quebec for 3 months. Did about 15 or 20 interviews in Quebec and Ontario, 35 interviews in Alberta here, and about 25 interviews in BC, and got the story. Then when I got home with these interviews, I transcribed them. And I made a transcript, noting particularly new bits of information that was good, but also great quotes from the people who were there. And then I went through this first draft of the manuscript that I had already written, and I inserted all the new material, all the new quotes, worked on it. And I ended up with a manuscript of about 400,000 words. It was a big story. And then I went to Jill Daffern, who, along with Tony, are the owners of Rocky Mountain Books. And we worked on it, on the manuscript. We made it read right, or better. And Jill was fabulous. She's a good editor. She doesn't try to change my style. I have a way of saying things, and she leaves it that way. She just makes me sound better. And we worked diligently and slowly for a year, working our way chapter by chapter through the book. Sometimes I went to a mountain hut. I spent a lot of time at Abbott Hut with my documents, just working on them for weeks up there. Weeks at the Elizabeth Parker Hut, the Wheeler Hut, even the Bow Hut. And gradually, over a period of a year, the polished manuscript took shape. Jillian said, when we started to work on the edit, she said, I want to create a book that 100 years from now, people will look at and say, that was a job well done. And I think she succeeded. I think 100 years from now, copies of Pushing the Limits will still be treasured. She did a great job. She worked for a year and a half after that on the layout, putting things together. It's the most remarkable layout. It's not simple, it's really complex. The way she's integrated the text and the photographs into this marvelous layout. Of course, there's the beautiful color section at the front. I remember the day that Jill said to me, Chick, do you want to see what your book's going to look like? And she opened up the file on her big Apple computer, and there was my book. There were the table of contents, then the color pages and the first chapter, and it's just marvelous when you see what a book's going to look like. It's such a revelation. And I should talk about the photographs. Wow. We got photographs, of course, from all sorts of archives, but from people all across Canada. I got photographs from 250 different people. I kept track of all the photographs I got, how many I got, what I did with them, what I scanned, and then when I sent them back to them and whether they had received them or not. I tracked all of them. I didn't want to lose any. In the end, I probably looked at 10,000 photographs. We scanned 1,000, and of course those scans are now all in the White Museum, as well as the interviews. And we used 650 photographs in the book, and they formed the core, the basis of what is now my archive of maybe 30,000 historical images of climbing and skiing in Canada. I persevered. I had a vision. I never lost my vision. I never felt overwhelmed. I call myself an extreme plodder. And that's what I do as a skier. I'm an extreme plodder. I do long horizontal ski trips. And my books, I take on big projects. I've had a number of big projects since then. I don't do too much at a time. I pace myself. And I just enjoyed it. The stories were so good. And I was happy. I never went hungry. I always slept well. I always even had a little happy hour each day with a bottle of cheap brandy. I went to the library and borrowed CDs of music. I listened to CBC radio. My total income, all those years of the late 90s, the 6 years that I worked on the book, my total income each year was between $6,000 and $9,000. And that's from my tax return. And in fact, I puffed up my tax returns because I thought they'd get suspicious if they saw how little I was making. But I lived on about $700 a month. And I was happy. I loved what I was doing. People were so good to me. The guys down at the Calgary Mountain Club bar, Mike Mortimer and Carl Hannigan, they always bought my beer. I didn't have to buy my own beer. Dave and Joey Seagram, they would occasionally send me $100 check and just say, "We like what we're doing. We like what you're doing. Just keep doing it." And Gerald Holdsworth, Mr. Mount Logan, he gave me a most beautiful little apartment in his basement to live in. I had my own toilet, big storage area, very comfortable. He gave it to me for $150 a month. And he said, "Just consider it my little contribution to your project." There were times where I just couldn't pay rent and I had no place to live and I wasn't going to quit. So I camped in the Yamnuska Meadows. I set up the old family big canvas tent and the old Coleman stove. And I lived out there in Yam Meadows. And, I was doing what I loved doing. I was healthy. I had lots of friends. I loved my work. And I had a project and I had a goal and I wasn't gonna quit. And it never got boring or daunting. It was always interesting. I think it really established the story of Canadian climbing for everybody, internationally as well. I don't think there's a similar book for any other country in the world. Of course, the Americans would have to do 2 or 3 volumes, and the British would have to do 6 volumes, but nobody's done it yet for any other country. The story of Canadian climbing is known around the world now. I remember way back in the 90s, there was a big coffee table book from France by Roger Friesenroche on the story of mountaineering in the world. There was one paragraph on Canada, one paragraph. And that's not true anymore. Our story is known around the world. I'm continually hearing from people who refer to the book. It's on their desk, it's on their bedside, they're well thumbed at all the magazines like Grip and Alpinist. The editor has a copy right there to refer to. So it did. It brought the story of Canadian climbing out of obscurity, and now we have a place in the world of world mountaineering.